Yeah, looks like I should start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to CUFI University, our second lesson at CUFI University. We have a half an hour tonight, and I want to share with you what I think is one of the most critical lessons that we need to know as advocates for Israel. It's a speech I've given a lot to our students. I cover it in my new book, Reclaiming Israel's History. It's a speech called The 5 No's. It's about the 5 times that the Jews of Palestine, later the Israelis, offered the Arabs of Palestine, now the Palestinians, a state of their own, a Palestinian Arab state, a Palestinian state. Each of these 5 times Israel offered it, the Palestinians turned it down. Why is this important? It's important because wherever you go today, I spend a lot of time on college campuses and in communities. Wherever you go today, most people have this idea in their minds. They freeze the frame today. They look today and they see Israeli soldiers in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and they say, aha, Israel is occupying Palestine. If Israel would just end its occupation, you hear that all the time, if Israel would end its occupation and let the Palestinians have their own state there, there'd be peace. Flowers would bloom, birds would sing, it would be a new era. That idea is so widespread and it's so wrong. And I think the best way to point out that it's wrong and why it's wrong is to point out the fact that Israel has done exactly that. Israel has offered to leave and give the Palestinians this land for their own state, despite the fact that it's Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland. Despite the fact that it's also a strategic heartland, a high land overlooking Israel's narrow coastal plain with 70% of Israel's population and infrastructure. Israel's offered it anyway. So the Palestinians could have their own state, and they've turned it down time after time after time. So if Israel's offered it and the Palestinians have turned it down, maybe Israel's not to blame for the lack of peace. Maybe Israel is not the source of the conflict. Maybe the conflict lay elsewhere, and indeed it does. The source of the conflict has been and is the fact that the Palestinians themselves have not reconciled themselves to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. And if getting this land means they have to recognize Israel as the Jewish state and say it's the end of the conflict with Israel and actually live in peace with Israel, they've not been prepared to do it. And it's this rejectionism, this refusal to recognize Israel and end the conflict with Israel that has driven the conflict from day one until yesterday. So what are these 5 times? We're talking about 1937, 1947, 1967, 2000, and 2008. So not ancient history, 2008, very recent. But the pattern is one that shows overwhelmingly. One side, Israel's been willing to compromise, rightly or wrongly, have been willing to compromise. One side, the Palestinians, has rejected every single offer. Their rejectionism, their refusal to live in peace with Israel is the reason why this conflict has been born and has persisted. So let's go back a little bit in time. 1937 is during the British Mandate. During World War I, Britain defeated the Ottoman Empire that had ruled the land of Israel, and Britain ruled it. And the League of Nations gave them a mandate, which means the authorization to rule, and they called it the British Mandate for Palestine. Britain's ruling, but they see there's a problem. There are Jews living there in the land of Israel and Palestine. There are Arabs living there in the land of Israel and Palestine, and the Arabs aren't too happy about the fact that Britain's letting Jews return to their ancient homeland. They actually started a violent revolt, the Arabs, to try to get the British to shut the gates to the Jews. In this violent revolt, they attacked not only British military, but also their Jewish neighbors, civilians, killing them. Palestinian terrorism goes back very far. Britain decides what do we do about this conflict? What do we do about this Arab revolt? Britain appoints a commission, the Peel Commission, to study the conflict and make a recommendation for how to solve it. The Peel Commission comes to the following conclusion. You got 2 people who want to rule the same land, Jews and Arabs. Why don't we divide the land, partition the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state? The problem is the Peel Commission offered the Jews a tiny percentage of the land, 20%. They offered the Arabs almost everything else. Interestingly enough, though, the Jews actually accepted this tiny 20% of the land of Israel Jewish state. It was the Arabs who rejected this plan. They rejected 80%. And instead they went back, they picked their arms back up and resumed their violent revolt. So this is offer number one, 1937, rejection number one, 1937. Tragically, when the Arabs of Palestine resumed their violent revolt, Britain appeased them. Britain said, okay, we're going to shut the doors to Jewish immigration. They did this in 1939. You know what was going on in the late 1930s in Europe? Hitler was in power and starting World War II. He wanted to expel the Jews first. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted to expel them. But when the gates of the only place on earth to which the Jews could return, the Jewish homeland, Israel, when those gates were shut because Britain appeased the Arabs, the Jews had nowhere to go. Hitler moved from wanting to expel the Jews to murdering them. 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust because of rejection number one. You have to remember this. Every time the Palestinians rejected a state of their own, people suffered. Jews and Arabs. Rejection number one, Jews suffered. 6 million Jews who could have fled to this tiny Jewish state instead were locked in Hitler's Europe and died in Hitler's death camps. 10 years pass, 1947. Holocaust has happened, 6 million Jews are dead. Hundreds of thousands more Jews are displaced persons wanting to go back to their ancient homeland. At this point, Britain says, we don't know what to do. They gave it to the United Nations. The United Nations studied the problem and came to the same conclusion the Peel Commission did 10 years earlier. You got two people who want to rule this land, the Jews and the Arabs, let's divide it. This time, the division was a little more fair. The Jews were given approximately 50%, the Arabs 50%. Most of the Jewish 50% was desert. Most of the Arab 50% was not. But okay, it was a more fair split. They offered this split. The Jews said, you know what? This isn't our ideal. It does not, the Jewish state the UN offered did not include Jerusalem and Jerusalem's Jewish majority. The Jews still said, we'll take it. And they danced in the streets with joy. The Arabs had a different reaction. They said, no, we don't want to split this land. We want it all. And the very next day, Palestine's Arabs attacked Palestine's Jews in the beginning of what became known as the 1948 war, Israel's War of Independence, a war which the Israelis did not want, did not think they could survive. But miraculously, and I mean miraculously, this tiny country, this ragtag bunch of soldiers, a third of Israel's war dead were Holocaust survivors who got off of boats into Israel, were given guns, and went right to the front lines. Somehow Israel survived this war. So rejection number two, 1947 partition plan. Jews said yes, Arabs said no. Palestinian Arabs attacked, and then the surrounding Arab nations joined them in this attack. Suffering was on both sides. 1%, imagine that. 1% of Israel's population died in that war they did not want. And the Arabs suffered in that war. It was the beginning of the Palestinian refugee crisis. War is bad stuff. That's why you don't go around starting wars. And in this war, a lot of Palestinians fled the violence. In some cases, Israel expelled Palestinian Arabs because in a war, you need to do things like take strategic villages, and Israel did that. They didn't want to. When they first started fighting, they only defended themselves, but that wasn't going too well. They were losing the war until they decided they had to do what every other army does and fight and take strategic strongholds. You're not happy about the Palestinian refugees? We should do what we do in other cases. Blame the aggressor. Blame the party that started the war. We don't blame America for defending itself from Japan and Germany in World War II, nor should we blame Israel for defending itself in 1948. So Israel's born. Israel survives. But the Arabs didn't reconcile themselves to Israel's existence. They vowed round two is coming. Round two, when we will attack Israel again and seek to destroy Israel again. Round two came in 1967. When Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq attacked Israel. This time Israel, again miraculously, survived. and beat back this Arab invasion in 6 days. That's why it's known as the 6-Day War. And at the end of this war, Israel had a lot of territory that it conquered and liberated from its neighbors. The Sinai from Egypt, Golan from Syria, and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria from Jordan. What did Israel do after surviving this war? What did Israel do after conquering all these territories, liberating Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria? The Israeli cabinet met shortly after the war and voted that we're willing to give back the Sinai to Egypt that had just provoked a war with us for peace. We'll give back the Golan Heights to Syria that just attacked us for peace. But the Israeli cabinet divided. There was a division about what to do with the West Bank that they had liberated from Jordan. Half the cabinet said we should give it back to Jordan for peace. The other half of the cabinet said we should give it to the local residents who are just starting to refer to themselves as Palestinians, a new people, the Palestinians. We should give it to them so they can have their own country. The Israelis were thinking about Palestinian independence before the Arab League was, before the United Nations was. They were thinking maybe we should give it back to them so they could have their own state. Unfortunately, none of these ideas got off the ground because shortly thereafter, the Arab League met in Khartoum, Sudan, and issued the infamous 3 no's. The Arab League got together after Israel's victory in 1967 and issued the 3 no's. They agreed no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. And that stopped Israel's decision to give back all this land in its tracks. So offer number 3, 67. Rejection number 3, 67. So Israel is ruling the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Israel reunites Jerusalem and makes East Jerusalem part of a united Jerusalem, capital of Israel. We're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem this June, and in our summit in July. It's a modern miracle that we're going to celebrate. And time goes on. But eventually, the Palestinians start rebelling against Israeli rule. It's called the First Intifada. They start saying, we don't want to be ruled by Israel. We want our own country. We want our own independence. And they rebel against Israeli rule. The Israelis decide, okay, we're an ancient people, 3,500 years old, with ancient roots in this land. The Palestinians are a new people. It wasn't until the 1967 war that Palestinians really started speaking of themselves, a majority, as a separate independent people. It wasn't until 1974 that the Arab League recognized such a thing as a Palestinian people. It wasn't until 1974 that the United Nations recognized such a thing as a Palestinian people. But when the Palestinian Intifada happened in the 80s, Israelis basically turned around and said, okay, if you're willing to renounce terrorism and renounce violence and recognize us, Israel, we'll negotiate with you and talk about creating a Palestinian state. And this became the Oslo peace process of the 1990s, which culminated in the Camp David meeting of 1999, when Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak met with President Bill Clinton and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat in Camp David. And it's where Barak made a generous offer to Arafat. Barak basically said to Arafat, you can have a state of your own, a Palestinian state in Gaza, 94% of the West Bank, and then we'll give you some land swaps from Israel to compensate for that 6% we're not giving back, and half of Jerusalem, Arab East Jerusalem. Everything basically you say you want, we will give to you. You can have it. This will be your Palestinian state if you sign on the dotted line and say we recognize Israel and are willing to live in peace with Israel. Arafat's response to that was to say no. And this isn't really debatable. Bill Clinton, this neutral umpire, later exploded and said Arafat's been here at Camp David for 2 weeks and has said no to every single offer. Arafat said no. He never made a counteroffer. He never said, no, I don't want 94%, I want 98%, or I won't be, give me a, he never made a counteroffer. Instead, he did something tragic. He went back home and started competing with Hamas to see which group, Arafat's Fatah or Hamas, could blow up more Israelis in what became known as the Second Intifada. In other words, Israel made the most generous peace offer to that date. And instead of a yes, instead of a counteroffer, instead of a negotiation, they got bloody violence. And this is both Arafat and Hamas started blowing up Israeli cafes, restaurants, and buses. Over 1,000 Israelis were killed in the Second Intifada. Over 3,000 more were murdered and were mangled and maimed. And let's be clear, when we're talking about Israelis, we're talking about Israeli Jews, Israeli Christians, and Israeli Muslims. There was a cafe in Haifa. Haifa is a shared Jewish-Arab city in northern Israel. There was a cafe in Haifa that was known for the fact that it was a center of coexistence. Jews and Arabs would go there to eat falafel and hummus. They blew that cafe up, and you better believe they did it on purpose, because the terrorists don't believe in peace. They don't believe in coexistence, and they don't care about humanity, Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. So that was the offer number 4, 1999 and 2000. Barak offered it, Arafat rejected it, and rejected it violently. So when you talk about the price paid for these rejections of peace, well, again in 2000, there was a steep price paid by Israel's population, because the rejection came in the force of a massive wave of suicide bombings. But hope springs eternal. And it wasn't just 8 years later when a new Israeli prime minister, Ehud Olmert, sat down with a new Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and tried again. This time he sweetened the deal. Olmert offered Abbas a Palestinian state in Gaza, half of Jerusalem, Arab East Jerusalem, and this time he offered him 94% of the West Bank, but he said, in return for that 6% of the West Bank we want to keep, it's where the settlements are, where the Jewish communities are, in return for the 6% that we want to keep, we're going to give you land from Israel proper, inch for inch, down to the last inch we want to keep. So in other words, with the land from Israel proper that we would give you, you will have, in effect, 100% of the West Bank. You will have half of Jerusalem. You will have all of Gaza. Everything you said you want. He put that on the table for Abbas. Abbas's answer was no. So the 5th offer, 2008, not that long ago, and Abbas's answer was no. This time, thank God, he didn't say no with suicide bombs. He just said no verbally, but no counteroffer, just a no. People debate, why did Abbas say no? Some people say he said no because deep down he will not reconcile himself to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. And he refuses to sign a document that would formalize his recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. He refuses to sign a document that would say this is the end of the conflict, no more. Others say he wanted peace. He just knew that if he signed that document, his own extremists would murder him. I don't know what the answer is, but at the end of the day, what difference does it make? Because of the fact that there's such extremism within Palestinian society, because of the fact that everyone who's contemplated peace with Israel seriously has ended up unwell, murdered in the history of Palestinian politics, because of this rejectionism that still dominates the society, Abbas said no. I'm watching the clock, so we have some time for Q&A. And that was 2008. Now, we have the beginnings of a new administration, and we have the Trump administration talking about maybe pursuing the peace process again. Look, every Israeli wants peace. And if they thought they could get a real peace in return, not just giving land to someone who will use it to attack you, which has happened every single time Israel's withdrawn from territories. If they thought in return they could actually get real peace and real coexistence, you better believe Israelis would be interested. Israeli parents are tired of sending their children off to war. But I would just point out that nothing seems to have changed with Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. The same Abbas that rejected peace in 2008 is still the head of a government that glorifies terrorists. As you all know, they name town squares and schools and streets after terrorists, people with blood on their hands. They still teach their children that rejecting Israel and violence against Israel is the way to go. They deny any Jewish connection to this land. They still insist the Jews have no connection to the land of Israel. And they incite their people to terror. But worse than that, and this is something that CUFI has been working hard to publicize, not many people realize, The Palestinian Authority doesn't just incite its people to terror. It pays its people to commit acts of terror. This isn't just like a thing they've done once or twice. This is Palestinian legislation. It's on the books. If you go to Israeli jail because you've murdered Israelis, you will get a generous salary from the Palestinian Authority, more than you can make through honest work. And the longer your sentence, translation, the more Israelis you killed, the more money you get, the higher your salary. And if you die during the course of attacking and murdering Israelis, which is often the goal when you're a suicide bomber, not to fear, your family gets that money. Now, Abbas and the Palestinians are rewarding the terrorists after the fact. But remember this, if you pay someone to kill somebody, murder for hire, you'll get convicted whether you made the payment in advance of the murder or after the murder. It doesn't matter when you make the payment. All that matters is that the murderer knew he was going to get the reward. So I would submit that it doesn't matter if the Palestinians are paying the terrorists before the fact or after the fact. What matters is that they know they will get the reward. And they know that this is something that is valued by their leadership. They know this is something that will get them glory. Streets named after you, Boy Scout troops named after you. Your village will turn out at your funeral and celebrate you like a hero, and your family or you will get richly rewarded financially. And so I just asked the question. 5 times Israel's offered to give. We're talking about the biblical heartland here. We're talking about Judea, Samaria, where every story in your Bible took place. Didn't take place on the coast where Tel Aviv is. It took place in this biblical heartland. And this biblical heartland is a strategic heartland. It's this highland overlooking Israel's narrow coastal plain. If Hamas got control of this, they could lob Qassam rockets into every cafe in Tel Aviv, every inch of Ben Gurion Airport, every bus stop in Jerusalem. Israel's offered it 5 times for peace. 5 times it's been turned down, and often violently. Has anything changed that would make us think it would work this time? When I look at the way Abbas and the Palestinian Authority behaves, when I look at the way they reward and glorify terror, I haven't seen anything change. And so I would just caution the peacemakers. Peace is a wonderful thing. Everyone in Israel wants it. Just be careful, because one of the 2 partners here doesn't seem to have the prerequisite that it takes to make peace, which is a recognition of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, a recognition of Israel's right to exist, and a refusal to embrace violence to further their political goals. Until we see that change, I remain very, very skeptical. Okay, I've saved a little time. We have 6 minutes for Q&A. If there are any questions, guys, I hope everyone knows what to do. Oh yeah, it looks like we do have a question. Why was the Obama administration one-sided against Israel? That's a good question. Actually, I debate friends about why the Obama administration was anti-Israel. Some of my friends say to me, they think Obama was a secret Muslim who hated Israel, hated America, and he somehow made his way into the West Wing, a Manchurian candidate. I never believed that. I went to law school with Barack Obama. I don't believe that's true about him. I actually think the reality is worse. And what I mean by that is, I don't think Barack Obama was some exception in American politics. We'll never see anyone like him again. I don't think Barack Obama was a Muslim. I think Barack Obama was a progressive. I think Barack Obama represents something real in America, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I think there are more like him. Bernie Sanders is the same way. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party sees the world in a certain way. They insist that all of the evil in the world comes from white Europeans and white Americans. All the suffering in the world is borne by innocent people of the third world. And they insist on putting the square peg of Israel into the round hole of their ideology. So when they look at Israel, they insist on seeing a white European people, the Israelis, oppressing an indigenous people, the Palestinians. That's wrong on so many levels. Level number 1, the Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. It was called Judea, for crying out loud. He might as well call the place Jewland. This is the place the Jews come from. But even more recently than that, most Israelis don't trace their roots back to Europe. Most Israelis trace their roots back to Jewish communities in the Arab and Muslim Middle East, Jewish communities that preceded the birth of Islam. They're in Israel because after Israel won its independence in 1948, their Arab neighbors got upset, their Arab governments got upset, they were attacked, they were persecuted, and they fled to Israel. And by the way, I would note this. These refugees, the Jewish refugees, which outnumbered the Palestinian refugees from 1948, they don't look back in anger. They don't hold keys to their homes in Libya or Baghdad or Damascus, say one day we will have our revenge, and they don't justify revenge, violence, some vengeance for what happened to them. They came to Israel, they looked forward, they built lives, they built families, they want peace. Unfortunately, the Palestinian culture has behaved and reacted very differently to their suffering and to their misfortune. A suffering and misfortune, I would add, that rests with their own aggression when they attacked Israel in 48. Okay, we have another question. I left my glasses at home, so I'm going to squint and read this question. Do you think the U.S. Embassy will be moved to Jerusalem? Another good question. We don't know the answer. President Trump promised he would move the embassy to Jerusalem. But we know what happens. President George W. Bush promised he would move the embassy to Jerusalem. President Clinton promised he would move the embassy to Jerusalem. Both of them, when they got into office, didn't do it. We know that President Trump came to Washington and heard from a lot of people, don't do it. It will start a terrible war. It will incite violence and fires and destruction. He heard from a lot of people that he shouldn't dare move that embassy. I think that advice is bad advice. That's why we in CUFI have been pushing very strongly that President Trump keep his pledge, keep his promise, and move the embassy. We just met with President Trump and Vice President Pence last week. I was there with Pastor Hagee and Diana Hagee and Sandy Hagee and Gary Bauer, and we brought up Jerusalem in our meeting. Interesting thing happened today. Russia declared that it would recognize West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Not a united Jerusalem, but West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Okay. By the way, I haven't seen the conflagration. I haven't seen the wars. I haven't seen the death and destruction. Our embassy is always in the capital of the foreign country in which the embassy is located. There's no reason why we should not move our embassy to Jerusalem. There's no reason why we should not recognize Israel's capital to be the city that Israel has chosen to be its capital, Jerusalem. And those who say, oh, it might upset the Palestinians, I would ask the following question. When the Palestinians are paying their own citizens to murder Israelis, how much angrier can they get? It's time to do the right thing and move the embassy. CUFI will continue to push for it. We have time for one more question, and I see no further questions, which is just as well because we have 1 minute left. So in my last minute, I just want to reiterate the highlights again. Wherever you go and talk to people not familiar with this conflict, but who watch the evening news or read a CNN, you're going to say you're pro-Israel, and they're going to say to you, how can you support Israel? Israel's occupying Palestine. Israel's the reason why there's a conflict in the Middle East. It's not enough to respond by saying, my Bible commands me to support Israel, although it does. It's not enough to respond by saying, but the Israelis invented your cell phone. You should be grateful, although they did. You need to know the facts and be able to say, are you kidding me? You're blaming Israel for this conflict? Do you know how much Israel has offered? Do you know what Israel's been willing to sacrifice for the sake of peace? And on 5 separate occasions, they offered the Palestinians a state of their own in 1937, 1947, 1967, 2000, and 2008. And 5 times the Palestinians turned it down, often quite violently. And you blame Israel for the conflict? No, you need to know your facts. You need to know Israel has been the one side to this conflict that's repeatedly offered peace and compromise, painful compromise. And the Palestinians have been the one side to this conflict that has repeatedly rejected the conflict, won it all or nothing, has gotten nothing, and in the process has caused enormous suffering to both Israeli citizens and their own citizens. So, know the history, learn the history, keep attending these CUFI lessons. And together we can be very passionate and also informed activists on behalf of Israel. Thank you all very much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time at CUFI. Good night.